This is Unfragmented, inspired by Colossians. For by him were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. Join our book club as we pursue a more consistent Christian life.
All right, welcome to Unfragmented. This is where we're just learning Christianity. We're learning how to think like Christians, and we're enjoying it. And I thank God for that we can indulge in his word. And he's given us something to look forward to, Christian thought. And I thank you for joining us. I'm Kevin Novak. Today is October 25th, 2023. I'm joined by Lee Bortons, Michelle Knepp, Nicole Parks, and Jennifer Eck. And then, as always, Emma Bortons is our producer. And this week we continue Alex Epstein's book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. We'll be discussing chapters 8 and 9. And just as a reminder, next month we'll be talking about Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. Greg Koukl, Tactics. I actually had a coworker stumble upon that book in my office the other day, and we got to talking about it. It was a nice 45-minute conversation, but it's a really good book. I just want to revisit briefly what we talked about last week. That is, it's unfortunate that we have ever lost a life or some kind of potential coming to fruition because of a lack of energy production. We also talked about how energy helps us minimize danger and how we must rely on Scripture, which will frame the way we think and keep us biblically positive. And we must be positive. The Bible has the solutions to our problems, mainly God's ways versus our ways, and that is God's ways versus sin. You go to Lee Bortons' YouTube channel for the archive shows, and I encourage you to do that. Many, many good things that we've talked about over these last 10 months. And with that, I look forward to hearing what Nicole wants to share with us from chapter 9. Nicole, what do you have?
So I want to take us to the very last part of the book on page 209. And honestly, like the last sentence, because I felt like just the way it just sums up everything that we've read and kind of can be our main takeaway. So he says in the last paragraph, but no matter what you read, the need for moral clarity will always be timely. Here in a sentence is the moral case for fossil fuels, the single thought that can empower us to empower the world. Mankind's use of fossil fuels is supremely virtuous because human life is the standard of value, and because using fossil fuels transforms our environment to make it wonderful for human life. So I want to know what your kind of thoughts, thinking from a Christian perspective, what y'all kind of thought, if you agree with that, because it says human life is the standard of value. Does that line up with the biblical worldview? And even kind of commenting on the word virtuous that was used, virtue and virtuous, I felt was used a lot throughout the book.
Well, it's refreshing. It's really good to hear that. And I say that not because I had doubt about Alex's views. It's just to really put the nail in the coffin on that is refreshing. And of course, it's Christian. And then I think by stating that, human life is the standard of value, that is like what we talked about before, connecting what we put value on, connecting it to God, but also not just making it arbitrary, like we also talked about before, where it's just utilitarian. It's a purely like relativistic utilitarian standard where it's like, well, whatever I like, I'll vote for, or whatever I like, I'll place value on. So it's good, and it's refreshing to hear Alex say that.
I was thinking about the virtuous side of things and how just human nature. And so, like, if you work at an industrial plant where some sort of, intentional or not, some sort of poisoning has occurred, and an unusual number of people have either cancer or colds or asthma or something from that. And let's say it's 1,000 people, right? And I believe every single life means something.
And when you see that, though, it makes you mad. And it's easy to see that when something bad happens. What's hard to see is that while that industry was being developed and accidents may or may not happen, that maybe 100,000 other people are healthier because of it. And it's not like I want to say, how many people will you give up and let be sick so everyone else can be healthy? I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying when you're in the middle of trouble, it's hard to see the positive side of anything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's interesting to think about. I was reading or listening to in chapter 7 where Alex was talking about what I would use the term externality, where some type of negative is being imputed on society without there being like an expense to the person imputing that externality, that negative, whether it be noise or some kind of air pollution or something like that. And I thought that was a good discussion to have, where it's like, okay, as Christians, as conservatives, how do we handle that? How do we handle private property and then dealing with people who are imposing on our private property? And one of the examples he gave, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it was in China where there was like this huge, I guess, man-made lake from pollution, and it was injuring basically the local people, but not other people. And he made the point that was basically a small amount of people taking on the disproportionate amount of injury, and he didn't think that was proper. And I thought that at least got to a more like what I would say egalitarian approach to externalities, or at least sin and so on. I'm not saying I have all that figured out. I'm just saying it was, I think, a good starting point. At least he was starting with the assumption that private property is good, and that's how we ought to like build out in terms of our thought process. Mm-hmm. So that's something I think of when you talk about like how we handle things like that.
Oh, and then, we're still talking about what Nicole had to say, and so if you value human beings, and we value every one of them, and something negative happens, so I think like how some of the arguments of the environmentalists are the same as what happened in COVID. Like, you hate your grandmother if you won't wear a mask, rather than really looking at the facts of what happened. But then when your grandma dies, you're mad, right? That it happened. And so we're trying to balance that between saying, yes, we enjoy people and we want them all to be well. But he also talks about earlier in chapters 7 and 8 about the risks of things. And, my husband and I are always saying to each other, everything has risk. Just being alive is a risk. But when you're the one being hurt, it's hard to remember that. And of course, we live in this cancel culture now where safety is prevalent. So with people make you feel like you're immoral if you're not concerned about that single person who is injured, because they can't look at the bigger picture of what's going on. And he's gave an excellent case throughout all 9 of these chapters about how positive the fossil fuels are. But that doesn't mean we can just be ambivalent to the suffering of others.
I think he maps out quite well how the environmentalists and the anti-fossil fuel people use emotions to control the narrative instead of the science. And I think we would be hard pressed to name anybody who has done something that has harmed someone that they don't go back and look to see how can they change it, how can they make it different so that it doesn't harm somebody. For with the that trailing lake that you were referring to, Kevin, and I know that if that was in the United States, any number of us, because we are technically a free country, would be trying to come up with a solution that is going to prevent people from having their teeth fall out, their hair turned white, severe skin and respiratory diseases. None of us in the United States wants to see that. None of us.
No.
But then for the environmentalists to then to put such a treasure upon human life, but many of them would be, to use his title, the moral case for abortion. You know, they would be willing to do that. The one thing that, and I think it can piggyback off of what Nicole brought up about this standard and supreme virtue, is on page 179, I think it's in chapter 8. John Haldren and Paul Ehrlich had a landmark book called Global Ecology, and they wrote, when a population of organisms grows in a finite environment, sooner or later it will encounter a resource limit. This phenomenon, described by ecologists as reaching the carrying capacity of the environment, applies to bacteria on a culture dish, to fruit flies in a jar of agar, and to a buffalo on a prairie. It must also apply to man on this finite planet. Well, that made me stop and think. I was just reading about this yesterday, about the Chan Zuckerberg initiative or foundation that Mark Zuckerberg and his wife are promoting. And basically what they want to see by the year 2100 is zero disease. So it made me think, well, what is disease? How do we define disease? As my question.
I mean, you'd have to wipe out all bacterial and viral life forms, and a lot of them are really good for us. Like, who's smart enough to know which ones to wipe out? I mean, it's just it's silly, right?
Right. So it's a disease is a particular abnormal condition that adversely affects the structure or function of all or part of an organism. So my question was, how are they going to accomplish this, first of all? Does this mean that we are going to work to have a perfect society? Eugenics? Are we going to do eugenics?
Probably.
And then, so how virtuous is that?
Michelle,
I think go ahead.
I think it's, what stands out to me is right there in your definition, that it's an abnormality. It's not normal, right? And I guess it might depend on where you begin your standard of what normal is, but I think as Christians we would say normal was the condition in which God created us in the garden. And since the fall, we have been abnormal. And there have been abnormalities, and God told us that this would come as a consequence of the fall. So I think it's just completely counter to our theology to think that it would even be possible to wipe out all disease.
Well, it's kind of like the Owenites that we read about, and thinking about the perfectibility of humanity, and that's why they all have to be in a school that's trying to perfect them. Right. So the ecologists are doing that also.
Yeah, and when I hear that goal, on the one hand, I think, wow, that's a good goal. But at the same time, I think that just flies in the face of reality.
Well, to make that happen, someone has to be in charge. And the worst kind of people who are in charge are people who want power over other people.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's tyranny.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but how is that then sustainable in a finite environment? Because I think that we would probably all agree that the Chan Zuckerberg would be a people, or they would have a belief of us hurting the environment. That, you know, all this population is going to hurt the environment.
Well, I liked what he said in chapter 8 on the first or second page. It said, because they talk about limited resources. And like I said the other day, there's not limited resources, there's unlimited resources. And Alex says, instead, we keep running into resources. The more we use, the more we create. Fossil fuel energy resources we discussed are created by turning a non-resource raw material into a resource using human ingenuity. And so right there is a presupposition that it's a worldview that's different from what we would have, because we know how unlimited things are. He also gives the example of saying that, so say the universe is finite, and if we go everywhere, we'll destroy it. And he's like, well, sure, that could be true, but we're never going to go everywhere. So you're asking a dumb question. You're starting off with the wrong idea.
Yeah, and it makes me think too about how he's talking about how environmentalists think that if we're like somehow nice to Mother Nature, then she'll be nice to us. Like, oh, if we just kind of leave her alone and coexist, like, the Native Americans did, like, it'll be cool. And we're still going to have death and disease.
Yeah, so and all this industrialism, I mean, it always has disruption's always negative at first till things get figured out. But we have this idea that nature is like, just like you said, Kevin, this can be a better way to live is naturally, forgetting that, well, then that means when a snake bites you, you die. You don't use medicine for venom. And that when hurricanes hurt you, you don't have buildings that were made with creosote and foundations that are waterproof, and so you can live. It's just not the way the Lord has given us to take dominion over the earth.
Well, I think that also ties back even just to the very first point that Nicole brought up. One of the things he says towards the end of that is because using fossil fuels transforms our environment to make it wonderful for human life. And that's what stood out to me in that is how many times we've come back around to the idea of dominion and taking dominion. And Kevin's brought that up a few times, and that's what we see here is
makes it better. If you look at it was page 174, we has that infant mortality rate in children under 5 and life expectancy at birth and malnutrition prevalence. And this book's older, and so since then, in the last 5 years, all these numbers actually are getting worse right now in our country. And it's not because of fossil fuels, it's because we're so wealthy and lazy that we're doing drugs. But that kind of thing never gets put into environmental data.
No, they're picking and choosing what their markers are, or whatever the scientific term is for that.
All right, Michelle, do you have a passage and some questions you want to share with us?
I did my population organism in the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, but I've got more. I loved in chapter 7 where he talks about all of the fallacies.
Let's go over those. Let's make sure we understand those 4.
Yeah. So he names fallacies as I would take it as, let me see what you guys think. I would take it as the anti-fuel, fossil fuel movement are responsible for using these fallacies, and the power that they have influences regulation and the role of government in making laws to supposedly make life better for us. So the first one is the abuse fallacy. that he names. And he calls it, the definition for it is,
It's in the middle of the section.
yeah, that's what I
He
was,
says it's irrational to say that because a technology or practice can be abused, it ought not to be used.
right.
Yeah. So
Yes.
just because there's bad things doesn't mean it's always bad.
Right. And he does talk about how, there are things, just even in our own bodies, there are things that are bad. And if it gets out of balance, yes, it's going to cause problems, but everything, there's something bad about anything of everything that we have. And then he has the false attribution, attribution
Wait,
fallacy.
Before you go to
Go
that
ahead.
one, look at the last sentence of the abuse one, because he gives a solution for it, which is what I like about this book, is all the solutions. That when we get this feeling that things are going bad, there's abuses going on, he says we need to advocate for best practices, not advocate to outlaw crucial technologies.
Yeah.
And like it's such a simple idea, but nobody talks about it that way.
Yeah. And he, at the beginning of that paragraph, he said, this is deadly because it can be used to attack anything a group opposes.
And it is, right? Homeschoolers abuse their kids because one did.
Right.
That all priests are bad because some of them were pedophiles, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Those are the exact same things that came across my mind, Lee, was when I was reading about that fallacy.
Yeah. It's used all the time. Okay, now go to the next one, Michelle.
Okay, so false attribution is claiming that one event causes another, devoid of proof. And his example was a film by Josh Fox called Gasland that famously showed people lighting their water on fire, a phenomenon that, unknown to many, is a frequent natural occurrence, almost always stemming from the natural presence of methane in the water. But it gets falsely attributed to fracking, as do many groundwater problems that are actually due to natural contamination of standard water wells.
When I read that, I was thinking about how just this past week, it's been going on for a few weeks, but it's finally making the national news, about how Mississippi River is so dry that the water of the fresh water of the river is no longer keeping out the salt water of the ocean at the delta down there, and how the groundwater is getting polluted by salt water. And that has nothing to do with any chemical factory.
Well, living in Florida for a few years when I was growing up, that was happening down in South Florida because of all of the development that was going on and swimming pools. People were using so much fresh water that they were actually, even in a tropical environment that Florida is, they were having problems replenishing the fresh water supply. So yes, the salt water was coming in, and I'm sure they've come up with a solution by now, but 40 years ago, this was a big deal down in that area.
Yeah, so whether it's, but even when you just said that, and that was what they said was the cause of it, I would always go, really? Are you sure that many pools can do that? Now, at the same time, they have a similar arguments going on right now in the Chicago downtown is sinking a few inches a year because of all the groundwater that's being used up. And so when I hear those kind of things, I just think, really? I don't know if I believe them or not.
Yeah. I haven't thought about it since I was 17, so I would probably ask that same question now, but that was the answer at 17, probably with my very liberal biology teacher.
Yeah, because if that was really the problem, like why would it not be an even bigger problem now? There's even more pools. But it might be that really was the right attribution. That could have been the true attribution. And the industry figured it out because people want pools. So the thing is, it's always so complicated. You just don't really know. And so people jump to the first fallacy that they hear that sounds like it could be right.
Hmm.
Michelle, what are the other two? You have the other two fallacies?
Yes, there was the no threshold fallacy, and this one was really messing with me. I do like the quote at the beginning of this: all things are poison, and nothing is without poison. Only the dosage determines that something is not a poison. And that was from Paracelsus in the 16th century. I hope I pronounced that right. Paracelsus. Oh, boy.
Oh, who knows how
That's
his mother called him? She probably just said, "Hey, Perry."
So I think that I found this definition: no threshold plus, oh wait, no, that wasn't it. I think it was at the top of 168. When one treats something as poisonous, regardless of dosage, he is denying the existence of a threshold at which a substance goes from being benign to harmful. If you deny a threshold, you can make a case for banning anything.
I liked his radiation example only because it was funny. It continues right after where you read. People said we should have zero tolerance for radiation, not knowing apparently that the potassium in your bone tissue emits radiation, enough so that sleeping with a spouse gives you almost as much radiation as standing right outside a nuclear power plant. Both activities are nowhere near harmful. So it's an amusing little example, but we should do the same thing that we're asking everyone else to do and say, is that true? How do we know that's true? How do we know his example is factual? So it makes me want to go look that one up.
And then what's the fourth one, Michelle?
Well, actually, there was two more. It's the artificial fallacy, and it is everything was simply. Oh, I think that the point he's making with not, I think the point that he's making here is that if something or that something natural is safe and something man-made is unsafe. How many times do we eat stuff that it's made with natural ingredients and they put that in there to make it sound good for us, but in reality, it's chemicals.
It's all chemicals. Well, you know, we people who think you should eat non-GMO foods make this same fallacy, right? That they want it all natural and organic. They're right there with the green movement. They're not giving any respect at all to how, because of the green revolution of the 1960s and better living by chemistry, that world actually stopped starving.
And he talks about that these GMOs actually made better crops. It allowed for the consistency of crop growing. And he talks about the fact that world hunger is when he wrote this is at the lowest it's ever been based on the population. And I think it is the increase in the farming techniques.
But see, the same things happen with them. So now that we've had these techniques for 40, 50 years, people are saying, wait a minute, we went too far and there is some harm being done. And so rather than ban things, we should just continue to advocate for more technologies to try to figure out how to solve that problem and find out what is that balance from growing more tomatoes without growing them too fast or bereft of all nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
So we got to figure it out rather than just banning things.
Right. You were right. That was the last one, Kevin. I got confused by my headlines, the section dividers.
That artificial fallacy is pretty easy to overcome because you could take anything that's natural and just try to eat it. And that's not going to be good for you. You know, like crude oil right out of the ground, you know, that's not good. It's not even good for your car. I mean, it's got to be processed. So, Yeah,
I
those are,
like what he says at the end of that section, close to the top of page 169. He says, to be against the man-made as such is to have a bias against the mind-made, which is to be against the human mind, whose very purpose is to figure out how to transform our environment to meet our needs.
That almost sounds like taking dominion.
Again, right?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
It's just to be clear that, you know, we can't be unsympathetic or compassionate, and we can't not admit that things get overdone. Three Rivers in Pennsylvania did get polluted to the point that fish were dying and you couldn't swim in it, but we cleaned it up afterwards. And there's always this disruption that occurs that makes people angry and should make them angry. And that's why they actually get cleaned up in the long run. But it's the ingenuity of the human beings that cleans it up, not the regulations of the government.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to jump back because I did highlight in chapter 7 about in chapter 7 the role of government, and he defines the role of government is to pass laws based on individual rights and standards set according to science and current state of technological evolution. The job of industry is to continue that evolution. So, you know, when you look at a Three Rivers situation, the industry is the one that came up with the technology to clean it up. And I think that with this anti-fossil fuel movement, I think the role of government is getting what's the word I'm trying to say? The thought I'm trying to say. I think they're getting boondoggled into passing laws that are unattainable in as far as human life is, or human quality is concerned, as to what we're used to living to now. I mean, what are Minnesotans going to do when there's no light and everything depends on solar for their energy?
They're gonna move away. People only could move into Minnesota once they got electricity, except for a handful of hardy folks.
Right.
Yeah, so we'll all be moving to temperate climates is what will happen. And then the very places that have resources that we appreciate, like the far north of both sides of our globe, that's where a lot of our minerals are that we can access. People won't want to live there to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
All right,
Yeah, and I guess.
what about
Sorry, go
you,
ahead.
Jennifer? What do you want to add? Because we got up to the 4 fallacies and we got the definition for the moral case. What else do you want to add, Jennifer, as we finish this book up?
Well, honestly, we've touched on a lot of the things that stood out to me. I would kind of piggyback on that last section that Michelle just read. The very next paragraph on page 161 talks about the relationship between two results that come if the government does its job. It says that if the government does its job, we will see the liberation and growth of energy production and progressive reduction of pollution and danger. So I like that he connects those two things, that he shows a relationship there, you know, with the appropriate laws. And he says, you know, if we had better laws, we would see, you know, that these two things go hand in hand, you know, more energy production, growth of energy production, and reduction of the downsides, the risks, the dangers, and the pollutions. And that, I mean, again, kind of takes me back to the conversations we've had about taking dominion, because I think there's a difference, or maybe I should ask you guys, you know, is there a difference between taking dominion and dominating our environment?
well, I think it depends, because if you're talking about like civil government, you can't just dominate other people, because, you know, you're not necessarily going to be able to force them into being a Christian and then conforming to Christian tenets. If you're talking about like in the individual level and trying to dominate like land or property or something like that, I think you can do that. Where it comes to other people, I think it has more to do with influence. So I think it just depends on the specific example. But one of the things you're talking about there, Jennifer, with civil government rules, I was thinking of Francis Schaeffer. I think it was him that said there's freedom within form. And you've got to have some kind of rules. That's okay. Civil government has to have some kind of rules. Just like a sports, you've got to have framework so that everyone knows what they can and can't do, but there's freedom within that. And I think that's where we get into civil government doing what they're supposed to do, and then humans being able to prosper and exercise their own man-made gifts within that, but not being arbitrarily or humanistically limited by like the deep state or bureaucracy and added rules that really aren't biblical, because ultimately those are going to hurt dominion and taking Christian principles forward.
I think just continuing to always ask the question, just what should we do? Not just because we can do it, should we do it? And that would help put a little bit of balance in both our arguments and in our industrial advancement, right? So for instance, within healthcare, there's so many things that we should do, and there's a lot more we could do, but we choose not to because of moral issues, like I'm thinking like the crossbreeding that's going on between human embryos and animals in third world nations. Our country has said, no, we're not going to do that just because we can do that.
That's good. That's good. That's good delineation. Can we do it versus should we do it? I worry though that is just, with a lot of things, that's just something that is delayed versus stopped, with at least other countries doing things and other people's. I don't mean that be negative. I'm just saying, as humanism rolls on, it can be hard to stop. But I like. I mean, overall, I really like how this book is. It seems to be based on dominion, and it seems to be based on just people getting back to thinking, back to the basics about what is really happening here, the basics of energy, much like we do with education. We're just revisiting these principles and getting back to, we're just trying to undo what we've been told. And those things are very easy to believe. I know they are for me. Like, wait a minute, why would I want to damage the environment? I've got kids. But we need to we're revisiting those things and questioning them. And I think that's really good.
He brings up an interesting question. I think it's interesting, where it's around page 196. I think my book's off from you guys because I have a digital book. But he talks about this guy, Amory Lovins, who says, because of what we might do with it is what people look at as disastrous. And so Alec is responding saying, well, we've seen what we do with energy. We make our lives amazing. We go from physically helpless to physical supermen. We build skyscrapers and hospitals. We take vacations and go on honeymoons. We visit our families and tour the world. We relieve drought and vanquish disease. We transform the planet for the better by human standard of value. So when he opened up this book, he was talking about valuing human life and human flourishing versus valuing the environment. And so I think the word better is another place where there's argument. So if somebody says, well, that makes the world a better place, we need to say for who? And some people would say, for what? And that seems to be where we have an argument. So I don't know, what do you think about that? Because is it a who versus what?
I think if young people are pressed on that, they would probably decide on who is better than what. I just think they're not being pressed on it. They're being told about the what versus the who. But I'd like to think, and I'm not naive about this. I understand, the state of younger people, and not to be critical of them. Older people, we need work too, but I think if we can press people on it and ask them questions, so we'll learn a little more about that next month. But asking them questions like, is it better if you were forced to choose to decide between people or property, or people and environment, which would you choose? And I think if people are pressed on it, they'll make the right decision. I gotta think.
It's just all the science is saying the opposite. He's got another place on 200 I want to make sure we read together too, was that the fossil fuel industry is a moral industry at its core. Members do immoral things, to be sure, but transforming ancient dead plants into the energy of life in a way that maximizes benefits and minimizes risks is an activity that we should be proud of.
Mhm.
It's a
Is
good
that-
way of putting things.
Is that where he talks about, there was one part where he talked about that coal mine that he visited, and they were concerned that he would be scared to go down there because of the risk. And the workers were bragging about how safe it was, and I'm only thinking of that because of, like the risk versus the reward and all that. But they were proud of it. But you would think that by the media, anyone who's involved with the coal mining, I guess it is a ministry, would be embarrassed to be involved with it. But those people are not. They're proud of it.
That's right. So there's one more place where he said something really positive. What we are not taught is that the biggest risk is not using fossil fuels, and that using them is incredibly virtuous. We're not taught that we're building a civilization that serves us in the future, and that we're creating knowledge and resources that can enrich everyone around the world. And so we need to really flip that around after having read this book, and keep reminding people it's always virtuous to help and serve other people.
Sometimes I wonder, as we talk about humanism, ultimately, like, what is it, like in a temporal sense, humanists, or sometimes I'll say liberals, are afraid of? Like, what are they temporally afraid of? Are they afraid of man maximizing our better potential? Are they afraid of running out? Do they think they're afraid of that we'll run out of resources? Are they bothered by the fact that there might be a lot of people around and they would be annoyed by that? Like, what is it that ultimately they're afraid of? Because some of these things are, I think some of these things we talk about with education and environmentalism and so on are, like, to me, almost sub issues. Why do they want to limit us? Why?
I don't know, Kevin. Do you guys have any answer for Kevin?
I mean, I think he's answered it, but I can't remember where I read about it. And I think it's that they look at Homo sapiens as destroying the planet. And the former head of the World Wildlife Fund has said, in the event that I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus in order to contribute something to solve overpopulation. Remember that in chapter 1, David M. Graeber is, in praising the theme of Bill McKibben's book, said, until such time as Homo sapiens should decide to rejoin nature, some of us can only hope for the right virus to come along.
Well, I can't help but think of Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, because they might have something to say about that.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're out to eradicate bacteria and viruses, right? So,
Yeah.
I hate to make light of that, but maybe they should get together and duke it out for the sake of everyone else.
Because they're both extremes, and neither are grounded in reality.
Hmm.
So, and so studying nature and its purpose and how to use it appropriately is really the joy and the duty of being a Christian.
Mhm.
So thanks, you guys. We're out of time. So Michelle, do you want to do your thing and then Kevin pray for us?
Sure. I hope that this book has given everybody reason to think about what is the latest headline grabbing news tidbit on the environment. And if you've liked what we've talked about here, please hit the like and subscribe, share it with your friends. And we've got another great book coming up next month.
All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us together. We have so many things to be thankful for. Although we admit, well, I know I admit that I have trouble paying attention to those things. And I'm more bothered by the negative news and the daily problems. But I ask that you help me and billions of people fix our eyes on you and just be thankful for what we have to look forward to. And there's nothing wrong with that, looking forward to taking dominion. We do pray for that, for more effective leadership, more effective explanation of your ways, your gospel, and all the principles that we see in the Bible. I do pray for it, continue to pray for Israel and the safety of all the people in the Middle East, not just the Jews, but all people. And but I do pray for their salvation, and including the Jewish people. And then finally, I pray for our House of Representatives, that they can move us forward and ultimately help us enact laws that are going to give us more freedom so that we can advance your gospel. I pray all these things in Christ's name. Amen.